the kind of critique that I'm offering of McCain is not one of some dreamy-eyed idealist. I think he's the dreamy-eyed idealist. I'm actually a pretty hard-nosed realist when it comes to these things, and my problem with him is that his premises about the way the world works are either false or just based on daydreams, and that's what I find dangerous about him. It's this kind of militarism combined with a dreamy-eyed vision. That's what has been most dangerous and deadly about the last 8 years, and in that sense, I see McCain as just a continuation.
Mm-hmm. One thing that strikes me when I watch McCain on TV lately, and I guess I'd probably argue that back in the 90s he seemed to actually be interested. But it seems now that he doesn't really know anything more than his talking points. That's why he confuses al-Qaeda in Iraq with accusations against the Mahdi army and whatever. It's because he's not even reading these stories at all. He doesn't know. He doesn't really care. So it's hard for him to keep his talking points straight on these complicated issues.
You can tell, on any issue, you can sometimes tell when a guy has really studied and immersed himself in the issue and really knows what he's talking about or she's talking about, or when he or she is just, as you say, just reading talking points. And I think you're right. When you start mixing up Sunni and Shia and, mixing up Iran and al-Qaeda because, well, they're both sort of anti-American, so they must be kind of linked in some way, it is a sign that of really lack of comprehension of what's going on. But it's more than just that. It's also dangerous. If you're going to treat all of our enemies the same because they are our enemies, you're missing all kinds of opportunities to divide them against them. For example, this has been a big problem of the Bush administration, who until very recently refused to talk with Syria because, well, Syria is just a junior partner with Iran. Iran is part of the axis of evil. We don't negotiate with evil. We defeat them, all right? Well, this passes up an opportunity, and I'm not saying maybe this is dreamy too, but at least it's worth pursuing, of luring Syria over to the other side, or at least to making them neutral, to splitting up that alliance. It would be as if Franklin Roosevelt, looking out in the world in 1941, says, well, Nazism is evil, communism is evil, I'm not going to form an alliance with Stalin in order to beat Hitler. In fact, I'm going to declare war on both of them. And, the world would have gone up in flames. We would have gone down to horrendous defeat on this high moral dudgeon.
Yeah. Yeah, nobody ever really succeeds in invading Russia, do they?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and, another thing here is that Bin Laden's message, and I don't know, I don't really have any reason to believe that it actually is catching on that strong. It seems like the jihadist movement is kind of treading water, even with the American interventions in Iraq and so forth. But it seems like the message he's trying to sell is that if the people of the Middle East watch closely, they will be able to discern that actually America is at war against all of Islam, that we do not differentiate between this sect or that, and so they shouldn't either. It's time for everybody to join together to fight against us. And it seems like, particularly with all the discussion about a possible American-Israeli attack on Iran right now, this is the kind of thing that could really do damage and turn...
I don't think it's really going to happen, by the way. But, yeah, you're right. I mean, the more that you talk like this, the more that you feed into bin Laden's propaganda. And what's ironic about it is that finally, at least the Bush administration in practice, if not in declared policy, is pursuing policies that do take note of these subtle distinctions. In Iraq and elsewhere. And McCain, to me, McCain is actually not even learning some of the more productive lessons of very late-era Bush that are worth learning. I think in some ways he would be not just a continuation, but a throwback to the, say Bush of 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, the first term Bush, even worse.
Or early second term.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many periods you can divide this into as a kind of back and forth of getting more or slightly less dense about the way the world works and what to do about it.
Well, let me pitch this at you. Let me try to be the devil's advocate here and say that, well, John McCain, he's an old man. He's running a tireless campaign, and he just hasn't had much time to read AntiwarRadi.com a lot lately and keep up with the news. But that once he's president, he'll be back on top of things. And
once you're president, you've got to come at your day's work with at least some basic principles. It's an outlook. I mean, you are so busy as president, the campaign is nothing compared to that. Here's the thing. I used to be a Washington reporter. I was a defense reporter for the Boston Globe for many years. And I would sometimes talk with McCain. I'm talking going back 20 years now. I always thought he was a pretty smart guy who had a handle on things. I think part of it is that he's gotten older, but part of it is that the world has changed, not since 9/11, but since 1991. The end of the Cold War really changed the whole scheme of things, America's place in the world. America drew a lot of its power from the fact that, from the existence of the Soviet Union, from the bifurcation of the world into two blocks. Some of our power derived from, the fact that a lot of the Eastern Bloc looked to us as an appealing alternative to the people who were to the regime that was enslaving them. And a lot of countries in the West look to us as protection against the Eastern Empire. Once the Eastern Empire is gone, they don't need our protection so much. They can go their own way. They can pursue their own interests. At the same time, China is coming up as an alternative source. India's coming up. Our economy is going down.
But this doesn't fit.
We have so much of our debt to Chinese banks. We don't have that much leverage in the world, and therefore it is no longer the case, if it ever was, that, we can sneeze and the rest of the world catches cold. Remember that old phrase? We can scour and certain countries tremble in their boots. It doesn't happen that way anymore.
It seems like the reality that you describe is greatly at odds with the neoconservative / McCainian vision of how the world is now. We're supposed to have, with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, it's not that we're losing all our satellites. Now the whole world is our satellite. There's no one to oppose us, they seem to believe.
Right, yeah, exactly. They thought that the end of the Cold War made us stronger, in fact, undefiable, when in fact, in a certain sense, it made us weaker. It made it harder to gain leverage. To the extent we want to expand our interests or pursue our interests even, we have to be even more determined and to form alliances, coalitions. It's harder to do so. It involves more compromise than it used to. And so, in fact, it requires a lot more delicacy and a lot more moral peril as well. We have to sort of form alliances with entities that we'd rather not. So, it's a much more complex world, and these kind of simplified visions like, well, let's kick Russia out of the G8 because he's not a very democratic guy, it just doesn't wash.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you about that. I'm sorry, we're at the time here. I just want to keep you a couple more minutes, if I can, to ask you about the Russian thing. I asked Philip Giraldi, the former CIA officer, on the show the other day, and he didn't know the answer to this either. Are there, as far as you know, any real, so-called geopolitical reasons why America needs to be confronting Russia this way, or is this simply ideology? It's not even pipeline politics or anything.
No, I don't see it at all. Russia is gaining immense wealth because of entirely because of oil revenues. It's actually now beginning to manufacture goods on the basis of this wealth. I was a Moscow correspondent from 1992 to 95, and it's a very different place now. I think it's time, in fact, to, trying to confront Russia is just going to be a resource-draining loser. I think it's time to, I'm not saying we have to cave in of our principles or abandon our own interests, but, it's time to reach out and build as many alliances on common interests with Russia as we possibly can.
Agreed. All right. Everybody, that's Fred Kaplan from Slate magazine. He's the author of Daydream Believers. Of course, the website is slate.com, and the article is How Much Does John McCain Really Know About Foreign Policy? Thanks very much for your time today.
Okay, thank you.